we could even hi, everybody. We're just giving participants a minute or so to join before we actually start our webinar this evening. Okay. I'm giving this one more minute for more people to join in. We are getting started shortly for all those who've joined us. I'll just mention before we start, for those of you who are on already, there is a Q&A. Feel free to enter questions at any point at the Q&A bubble at the bottom somewhere on your Zoom screen. And okay, I think if Jennifer's ready, we're going to go ahead and start since it is just after 6:30. I see more people are logging in and joining us. I think we'll just go ahead and get started though. Okay, so for anybody who's just joining me, I'm Susan Greeley. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm the National Director of Wellness Services at Castle Connolly Private Health Partners. Thanks for joining in for another SENS Wellness webinar. And tonight's focus is on the pillar of nutrition, something very near and dear to my heart. So I do want to mention these webinars that I put together are intended to educate and support all of our members. And for those of you who know me, you do know it's my goal to truly inspire and empower all of you to make positive lifestyle choices and improve your overall health and well-being. So that said, right now, I feel that we keep hearing this phrase now more than ever, because it's fitting in so many areas of our lives. And now more than ever, people realize how important their personal health is. For tonight's topic, it relates to the health of our food supply as well. So this is a very interesting topic that I think some people interpret in their own way. So I want to just start with a definition of what is clean eating. It's quite honestly and briefly, it's simply a way of eating that involves eating whole fresh foods for the most part and reducing your intake of highly refined and processed foods. So there's no specific way to do it. It isn't, like I said, a defined diet. Think about going back to the basics. And I think now more people are finding themselves in the kitchen. They're buying foods and cooking them from scratch. And that's a lot of what clean eating actually is. So that alone has become a very positive switch in many people's lives. I've been a registered dietitian, nutritionist for over 25 years at this point. And again, it's my goal to help people make informed, healthier choices. So I like to think of it in terms of not just eating, but also nourishing ourselves, our families, our communities, and the environment. And that's my segue to my speaker this evening. I do want to comment on how we also are seeing more heroes everywhere. There are a lot of unrecognized people and companies. And what I was thinking about is how they're becoming the solution to a lot of our health problems. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Jennifer Maynard, and I see that she's definitely one of those people who is working to be a part of the solution. So Jennifer spent over 20 years in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, and she originally pursued that career to improve human health. So she ended up leaving the pharma industry as a very successful pharma exec, and she started a farm called Greater Greens to focus on food as medicine and regenerative farming operations. She then, once that was fully operational, Jennifer co-founded Nutrition for Longevity with the company El Nutra to provide clean, healthy produce and use the food in a precise way of using macronutrients and science behind the longevity diet, which is by Dr. Walter Longo. Most recently, Jennifer founded United for Longevity, and this is a nonprofit that focuses on food as medicine efforts as well to combat acute and chronic illness. And she also provides food and nutrition services to support some of our frontline healthcare workers during this COVID-19 crisis. Pretty phenomenal. So it's my pleasure to turn things over to Jennifer. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you. So I'm really happy to be speaking about this topic because it is near and dear to my heart. I have been passionate about being in the space of medicine, but I feel like we need to be doing so much more with food as medicine. So that's what I wanted to focus this presentation on, is talking about a little bit about even the history of our food system and how we got to where we are today. And some of the things that we can do to maybe deepen our understanding of food, where it comes from, and what we can do to potentially change it to better our health. So if you have any questions, you can ask us throughout the presentation, and we will try also at the end to open it up for any questions for any team members. So, except it is not letting me put the deck forward. Okay, there we go. Okay, so one of the first questions I want to ask the group, and if we were in a forum, I would ask you to raise your hand if I could see you, but you can go ahead and raise it in whatever room you are. But just to get us thinking about the history of farming in the United States, how many people that are watching this have had in their last 4 generations of their family tree, how many had farmers involved in that? So I know for me, I have had farmers in almost every single branch of my family tree, and my family did come to the US many, many generations ago. And the reason why that is the case for a lot of multi-generation families in America is in the 1800s and the 1900s, 90% of Americans either owned a farm or worked on a farm. So it is how we colonized the United States. And it's actually how most of the workers or the farmers came to the US is through, I would say, the first big business in the United States, which was the railroad companies. So they actually launched massive campaigns to bring in farmers, first from Germany, then from Ireland, and all over the world, to bring in people to colonize the United States so they could actually create a market for themselves. So they either provided free land or extremely inexpensive land for farmers that could come over and start a new life in the United States. And that created one of the first rises of the farm in the United States. You know, it really was seen as a land of abundance. You could just drop seeds in the ground and it seemed to just flourish. And the farms over that time went from 2 million farms to over 6 million, which nowadays doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're first starting to really build a country, that's a lot of farms and that's a huge growth. But obviously these were smaller farms, and these were farmers that had some farm experience, and they brought over their families, and these were usually around 100-acre farms. So you had a lot of farmers, a lot of small farming. They were growing diverse farms, so diverse amounts of food or types of foods, and even maybe some cattle, some goats, some chickens. So they were very diversified farms, and this was something that came over as a practice from Europe. But this started shifting pretty heavily already in the 1920s when urbanization, the first wave of urbanization, hit us in the United States. And this mainly came as a response to World War I, when a lot of our soldiers came back, and either they were the farmer themselves and they either didn't come back or they decided they wanted to move to the cities. But especially a lot of farmers' sons and daughters, they ended up not going back to their farms after World War I. So we had a little bit of a labor shortage issue. The second thing that happened is most of our colonization in the US happened because around successful farm locations. So the really fertile soil, the best soil, is where villages popped up and cities started to pop up, because we could thrive around where the food was successfully grown. And what happened with urbanization is it even did that further. So we started pushing out all of the farms that were on this extremely fertile land onto less and less fertile land. And that created actually a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges that we faced in the 30s that they do think was heavily involved in creating the Great Depression, and you guys may have heard of this in your history classes, is the Dust Bowl. And if you look at the USDA and their investigation of what happened in the 30s, it was a continued moving out of fertile land to less fertile land. And our farming practices were even back then very aggressive. So we were doing a lot of heavy plowing of the fields, which was aerating the soil too much and essentially eliminating our topsoil. And we weren't using cover crops or a lot of the things that we're now recommending today for regenerative agriculture. None of that was being used. So a lot of the surface soil was washing away from the farms either through rain or wind. And so we essentially created the Dust Bowl, and we created a lot of depletion of our farmland as we moved around and started this urbanization wave. And that just further kind of compounded, and the government decided we were in a critical state as a country. We need to take over the entire economic sector of the agriculture and subsidize it heavily so we can get our food system back on track and keep our country from a massive famine. So that was one of the biggest changes, I would say, in our entire food model happened actually around the 1930s when the government took over our farming sector and started controlling pricing. So we had major subsidies going to a very finite amount of crops because they had to do this in a central way. They had to standardize, they had to simplify and find a way that they can control a massive entire industry. So what they did is they subsidized corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and dairy. And the other thing that happened is they challenged the farmers and the food industry to come up with innovations that we could feed people so we would never starve as a country. So we had some really delightful innovations come out of the 1930s, mid-1930s, and into the 40s. So great things like our fortified white bread. We had the great American invention of American cheese. We had Skippy peanut butter. We had all these inventions. We had different ways of processing meats into things like chicken nuggets. So these were things that we were adding now for the first time, heavy preservatives, so we could store them for a really long time so we never have to face famine. We could produce them very cheaply, so something like a chicken nugget maybe only has actually a third of its ingredient is actually chicken, which is the more expensive component, and the rest is corn and soybeans and things like that. So they really challenged, come up with really inexpensive food that we can feed a massive growing population in the least costly way, and we can push it out and provide it to families across the board. And because there was so much fear in the Great Depression, it created a wave of marketing. If you look at modern marketing, it basically started after the Great Depression when people had massive fear about starvation and going without things. So it was all about the fortified bread will help with calcium and iron, so your children will be nourished and healthy. And so all of these companies jumped on the bandwagon and started producing highly processed foods that had additives, preservatives, and a lot of what we have in our food system today. And what's interesting is the subsidy model hasn't changed much since the 1930s, the New Deal. So if you look, it's still highly government controlled, the entire agriculture sector, and that feeds right into the types of crops that we grow and what we focus our money on. And so that's something that I just think is really important to understand. The first food revolution that really happened was driven by a lot of fear and a time that we did have shortages in agriculture. And it actually created the second revolution that we faced, which was called the Green Revolution. And that's what affected our agriculture system. So all of these things fed into each other. And once this huge subsidy came up, we also were looking at ways, how can we produce even more food on the farmland that we have? And how can we handle, still the one remaining issue is urbanization, where fewer and fewer people want to work on farms. So you went from that 90% down to less than 30%, and now today less than 1% of Americans are working on or own a farm. So fewer and fewer people are growing the food, and we're focusing on monocropping, a very set amount of crops that can be managed and controlled and subsidized in a very clean and efficient way, and a food model that was created, or food innovation that's surrounded and focused on those 5 areas that are heavily subsidized. So then that was the food revolution. The second revolution was the green revolution, as they call it, which is what massively shifted our agriculture model as it is today. And this included in the 1940s, scientists realizing we have a lot of leftover chemicals from World War II that could solve a lot of our problems. So the biggest problem was soil fertility. We had depleted the soil. We had, for example, in the Dust Bowl, there was almost no real soil left. It was dust and fragments of dirt remaining. So how can we revive this and actually produce high yielding crops? So they found out we had a lot of ammonia left over in warehouses from weapons manufacturing that could be turned into nitrogen chemical fertilizers. And it was very cheap. We had lots of it, and it could even be produced in a very inexpensive way. So we started using that on our farmland, and it sent our yields through the roof. So we got a lot more crops out of it. If you feed more to your plants, they will grow faster. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily stronger plants. And it also means that you often create an imbalance in your soil, which actually creates, even though they may grow faster, potentially weaker crops. And what started happening is, even though we were getting more yields on the farmland, they were much more sensitive to pest, and we had major pest problems with insects. So then we solved that problem with a lot more pesticides being introduced. So if you look at when most of the chemical aspects of agriculture were introduced, it was between the 1940s and mid-1950s, and that was the start of what we call the Green Revolution. Also in the 1950s, the mechanization of agriculture boomed. So it went from almost no one having tractors to almost every farm having at least 1 tractor, and in most cases over 2 tractors. And that allowed farmers to do a lot more with less labor. So they could produce more crops per acre because of their chemicals that they were using, and they could use mechanization to have fewer labor and people working on the farm. And this is basically what is our current agriculture model. It has not changed much since the 1950s. If you look at innovation, yes, we may have drones that look at a heat map of the crops, and they may identify where we need to put more fertilizer or less fertilizer or more sprays. But if you look at the mechanization aspects of it, other than self-driving tractors, there has not been a huge innovation in agriculture until what's starting to happen today. So I just think it's important for people to understand some of the things that drove the first food revolution, which was a change to a lot more processed food in our diet, which was a result of the Great Depression. And then what drove a lot of our farming behavior, which was also a fear and a result that came out of that as well. So it changed the history of both our food model as well as how we grow our food. And I think one of the things that's really important to that is we see also a big shift in our healthcare costs around that same time. So if you see our cost per capita of food went from 22% in the 1950s down to less than 6% today. But if you look, our healthcare costs have essentially eaten up any of that savings. So we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, yet we're only the 34th healthiest country. So could the food be a direct connection to the health problems that we're now seeing? And are we starting to look at these trends and understand some of these things that were pivotal around this time that are impacting our overall health system as well? And I show a picture of a factory farm because also in the Green Revolution, also more antibiotics started getting used and chemicals that also allowed us to have more feedlots with more animals in these condensed spaces. So it came along with that as well. So why does it matter? Why do we think that this has an effect on our health? So I want to focus on 4 areas to talk about today. One is the chemical body burden that could be affecting maybe not as much our human cells, but our gut microbiome. So we'll talk a little bit about that. A loss of habitat, not just from, I'll talk about the soil microbiome, but also above the ground, what's going on with loss of habitat. Also a loss of connection with our plants and their microbiome and how that's affecting our food system. And then this overall loss of diversity in our food. So we are eating a lot of the same thing, and we've taken a lot of the diversity out of our diets. And so just talking about that and the effect that it can have on our bodies as well. So I'm going to start with this one. I know not everyone likes to talk about the chemical body burden because it can be a frightening thing, but I do think it's important to put these numbers out there so people are just aware of how much we are exposing ourselves to on a regular basis. So the US produces 3.5 billion pounds of known toxic chemicals each year. I was born and raised in Alaska, so I was a little bit sad when I saw the chart of the chemicals per state, but it's a lot, and it's important to understand that these are pretty much ubiquitous. They're not just in our crops, so we're using them as insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides in most of the crops that we produce. But they're also in this couch that I'm sitting on. They're probably in this frame. They're in the either the paint or the wallpaper in our walls. And we look at these as, well, they're just residual levels. Most of them don't even have to be on the labels of our products. And some of them have been tested to identify if they're harmful to humans, some have not. But even the ones that have been tested, it's oftentimes more looking at it in a microscope on what is it doing at a cellular level to our own human cells. But more what we're looking at is what is the effect on our gut microbiome, because a lot of these chemicals were specifically designed to destroy or eliminate or deter pests of some sort, whether it's bacterial or insects or different fungus or different herbs that are, or plants that we don't want in our farms or somewhere else. And so it's really important to understand, do these things have a bioaccumulative effect in our bodies? And the example I use is we thought for a long time in the US that DDT was a very safe chemical. And even after it being banned for over 40 years, it's still present in 99% of humans that are tested every year by the CDC. So we don't usually fully understand these chemicals until 10, 20, maybe even 30 years later when they're ubiquitous around us. And this is something that I just think is important as we start to see more and more gut challenges within our bodies. Are we actually damaging our gut microbiome with our chemical body burden? So there's things that we can do to start looking to reduce this by looking at our products that are around us and really understanding what are the things that we can control that we're exposing ourselves to, and at least reduce that as much as possible. Some things are all around us, we can't reduce them, but there are still a lot of things in our lives that we can control. So another component is the loss of critical habitat. And one of the ones that I focus on as a farmer is the insect biomass. So I'm not saying as a farmer that I love every insect. You know, as a farmer, you have this love-hate relationship with insects because you know that some of them may damage your crop, but you also know that there's massive benefits. And it's all about finding a balance. And it's really concerning because you don't hear it much in the news, but we've lost 80% of our insect biomass in the last 20 years. So if you ever look at the food chain or you look how crops are pollinated, that's an astounding amount of loss that we have in the insect world. So we talk a lot about larger mammalian species that we lose or become extinct, but we very infrequently talk about the insects because most people associate insects as pests, not beneficial insects that actually drive our food chain. So I think this is really important. But what I'm going to actually emphasize more than this is the loss of diversity of our soil microorganisms. So we understand, if you put it in perspective of what we understand about the human body and science behind the human body, we know about our big toe worth of knowledge about soil biology or the soil microbiome. So it's really important. We're literally creating mass extinction of our soil microbiome without even understanding the health benefits that it brings and what we might be actually eliminating from our overall environment. And people say, well, why is that important? If we don't even know that they're there, you know, could they really be that important? And I think science is just starting to show us why these are so important. And I like to put it in perspective of the plant holobiome. So if you've never heard holobiome, this is the collection of all the DNA of the plant itself and all of the bacteria and organisms, microorganisms that surround that plant. From its air microbiome, which is about a foot around the plant, there's actually bacteria and viruses and different things around the plant that are helping send it signals. But there's also 4 other microbiomes associated with plants. The one we focus on the most and know the most about is the Rhizosphere Microbiome. That's where the root mass of the plant is. And that's where the plant mainly interacts with its environment in the soil. And that's where we've learned a lot in the last few years about how plants actually interact with the soil around them. We always thought it was just this mineral and chemical exchange. Okay, the soil needs carbon, so the plant actually sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere and oxygen and nitrogen, and it sequesters that into the soil, and the organisms can use that. And in exchange, they convert elements that are in the soil into something usable for the plant. So it's this nice symbiotic relationship. And that's, I think, as far as we thought it went for a really long time. And now we're actually realizing it goes so far that the organisms around this Rhizosphere microbiome are actually changing the plant at a genetic level. So that's pretty profound for us to realize that these organisms are actually helping the plant cope with stress. That is more than anything what this holobiome does, is that collective DNA brings more biodiversity and allows the plant to cope with stress. So as an example, a portion of the plant's holobiome or microbiome is passed down in the seed, generation after generation. So maybe there's organisms in there that have experienced drought, and those organisms know how to tell the plant, you need to send out deeper lateral roots that can pull in more water. So you may have a plant that would normally only have a 1-foot root base, suddenly have a 2-foot root base. That is a genetic level change that is driven by the soil microbiome. You may have the plant being infected by aphids, as an example, and through chemicals in the soil microbiome, the air microbiome, the microbiome is actually telling the plant, you need to produce more phytochemicals to fight off these aphids. And then the aphids, it's too stringent for the aphids, and they leave and go to another plant. So it's truly the plant's ability to manage and cope with stresses that are put on it, environmental or all directly surrounding the plant. When we cut off the soil microbiome, the plant's entire immune system is compromised. So we focused a lot of our science on GMO crops to adjust maybe 1 or 2 aspects of the crop. And we're realizing now, just by changing the soil microbiome, we can change thousands of aspects of the plant. So I think a lot of our science and focus has been in the wrong area, where we're actually limiting the plant's ability to cope with stress. And the reason why this is important to me and why I got into farming is that directly affects human health. And I think what's really important to understand how that affects human health is to look at the human holobiome. So I don't know how many of the guests on this webinar have heard of the holobiome concept, but again, it's the same for humans. We have an air microbiome that is surrounding our body. And I won't get into that. That could be a whole nother discussion of how fascinating the air microbiome is around us and how it's even affecting the way we interact with other people. But we also have this, and if you look at our similarity to the rhizosphere microbiome of a plant, we have our gut microbiome. It's also where about 90% of our immune system is surrounding that gut microbiome. Similar to a plant's immune system is in their rhizosphere microbiome. So very similar, and also similar in how we exchange and how our gut microbiome, similar to the soil microbiome, modulates a lot of our activities or a lot of our metabolism. So similar to a plant, if we have a healthy gut microbiome, it's affecting everything from our mood. 90% of our serotonin is produced in our gut. So it's considered the second brain. Our gut microbiome also, because our immune system is right there, we can respond in different ways also by the food that we eat and how we interact with that gut microbiome. So if we're consuming food that is high in pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides that are designed to damage these different organisms, why would we think that that's not doing the same thing in our gut? So I think it's really important to really look at ourselves and plants, not in a single system, but looking at it in this holistic way of the holobiome, because our body, when we, for example, eat a plant, say we're going to eat a purple Okinawa sweet potato, and it's really high in anthocyanin, and which is a phytonutrient that that plant produces. What we're realizing is similar to the plants, those trigger stress coping mechanisms in the human body in a very similar way. It may not be the exact same metabolic pathways that are doing it, but they're very similar. So when we are not taking care of our plants and we don't have that biodiversity and it's not sending those signals to the plant to create these phytonutrients, we're eating plants that then have less phytonutrients, which are actually feeding our gut microbiome and modulating our overall system. So we're actually depleting our own body's ability to manage and cope with stress because we're also taking that biodiversity away from our holobiome. So biodiversity, when we talk about holobiome, is really important. It's more than 50% of the cells that make up my holobiome are not my own cells, at least human cells. I consider them mine because they're all part of a system. And I think in modern medicine, and part of the reason I got out of the area I was practicing is we focus so much on these individual systems and we don't look at the body holistically, including the more than 50% of cells that are not human cells. And we're not working to protect those cells in every way we possibly can. And food is one of the most obvious ways that we can start to affect that in a positive way. So what could we do to address this loss of diversity? From a farming standpoint, I think it's rather easy. We need to grow more diversity of crops, and we need to support the soil that can really support these different crops and build up a healthy soil microbiome so these plants are extremely healthy. We as individuals can start adding more color to our palette. So I give the example of these different colored carrots. A lot of people don't know we've also hybridized a lot of that naturally out of our food. So carrots used to be, in the 1700s, all carrots were purple. We hybridized them to orange because it was new and sexy, maybe a little bit sweeter. And we've done this to ourselves in a lot of places, and we've really created a palette in the US of food that's very muted. And that's really taken away a lot of the phytonutrients from our diet, not just because they're lower because of the way we grow the food, but they're also lower because we have a narrower spectrum of food in general that we grow. And remember, I said 5 things are subsidized. If you look at 80% of the crops we grow in the US, or food that we grow in the US, 80% is focused on basically 5 crops. Well, 4 crops, because dairy's, I guess, a crop, but grown in a different way. So again, when we narrow that diversity of our microbiome and our gut microbiome, we're taking away the ability to address biotic and abiotic stressors. And I know for me as a human, I feel like we have more stress in our environment today than we ever have before to cope with, yet we've taken away a lot of nature's ability to cope with stress, and we've eliminated it from our food model and from our own environment around us. So I think that's just something that I want everyone to really think about as they think about their food and their connection to food, is how it all really fits together from this origin of our food and where it came from, at least in the US, and how we've changed that food model from a very raw whole food model where people were eating mainly fruits and vegetables and small amounts of meat, into a model where we now have highly processed foods and a lot more meat in our diet. They say even based on the recommendations that are given by the USDA, the FDA, all the different food recommendations, the typical American still consumes 50 grams more protein per day than is even recommended. And if you look at longevity regions, which is where we focus a lot of our crops on growing similar produce and following similar macros, that's actually really low. So we actually encourage people to add a lot more plants to their diet and to try to get a lot of diversity when they're eating those plants. You may have heard eating the rainbow, and I'm not talking about a certain candy. I'm talking about all of nature's candy, which is all these diverse fruits and vegetables that we should be bringing into our diet. And they all mean something different. And one of the things that I think is interesting about plants is they can self-select their microbiome. So I told you some of it's passed down by their seed, and the others, they reach out to all those organisms and see which ones are going to provide them with the best support when they need it. And our bodies used to be able to do the same thing. If you look at instinct of what humans, and this has been proven, if you look when you're under stress, your body actually sees certain colors in a much more vivid way. So you might see bright reds and bright purples, and you would naturally be drawn to that. But because we've now tricked our bodies so many times with red velvet cake instead of a strawberry or a red bell pepper, our bodies don't know what they need anymore. They're so disconnected from their food. We don't smell our food. We don't pick our food. We don't break our food. We're so disconnected that our bodies don't know very easily what they need anymore. So this spectrum of colors we're disconnected with. So we are trying to reintroduce this to people, to have your purples with your anthocyanins, and to understand that each of those colors is a pigment, but it's also associated with a different spectrum of phytonutrients. And your body needs this broad spectrum of phytonutrients because they are helping you cope with stress. So what does all this mean, and why did I feel it was important to start with the history of farming and how we've impacted our soil microbiome? Is I am a big believer of the universal biome, which is not to just look at this overall picture of the plant holobiome and this overall picture of the human holobiome, but to look at it universally, because we are all connected to the plant world through the food that we eat, through our gut microbiome. All that food is either feeding and supporting our gut microbiome or potentially damaging it, and we have the choice to control that. And connecting with our food, from 90% of people in the US being associated with our food model to less than 1%, people are, again, more disconnected to their food. They don't necessarily understand how it's grown. I think if people were more educated and aware of that, they would make different food choices than they make today. We have created a food model that is very processed, and we've created a food model that actually is while it's very cheap when you look at it independently, it has absolutely impacted our healthcare system and the costs of our healthcare system. So not only is it a way that we can help human health, but we can also make it more financially sustainable. I think also our current food model is not very sustainable. If you look at farmers, most people are surprised that it's the highest suicide rate profession, because most farmers are not financially doing great. They are still massively in debt, more now than ever before. So it's also not working for the farmers that are also producing the food. So it's a very backwards model that we have to really start addressing and taking seriously. And then really understanding how the different chemicals are impacting that overall system and our overall bodies, and looking at it in this holistic way. So I wanted to, before I open it up for questions, I wanted to definitely focus on a few things that everyone can do, because I know I went through a ton of material just now, so I can ask, or I can answer any questions anyone has around any of that. But I think it's important to know what actions we can take to start changing this in our lives even today. And so one of the things is to eat clean. It was, again, the definition of this webinar, or the title of it. And that part of that is eating less processed foods. So it's not necessarily about the vegetables themselves being clean, but less processed foods, more whole foods. So if you look at longevity regions of the world, they eat about 10 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So a very plant-heavy, whole food around, that's what their diet is basically surrounded by. Getting 25 grams of fiber a day. If you're eating that much fruits and vegetables, you're more than covered. But most people are not consuming enough fiber. Only 1 in 10 people even get the 6 servings of fruits and vegetables that are recommended a day. So a lot of us say, oh, I'm getting plenty, but in reality, most of us aren't even getting close to that lower recommended level. And then really making sure we eat healthy fats, but that we're not consuming a lot of processed, saturated fats. And then one of the things is, again, if you look at longevity regions, if you look at the environmental impacts, making sure that we may not live a vegan or a vegetarian lifestyle, but a reducitarian lifestyle where even if we're eating meat, that we're doing it on a much smaller frequency and buying really sustainably grown meat that can actually contribute to farming rather than diminish it. 80% of our crops right now in the US are grown purely for cattle feed. So, for livestock feed, and that's mainly cattle. So it's a huge energy consumption. It's a huge impact on the environment. So I didn't hit on that much, but that's also another reason. It's why I eat mainly plant-based. It's not just for my health, but it's for the environmental reasons. Also knowing how your food is grown. I think it's really important that people get reconnected to their food. To the point of getting your hands dirty. Like I'm telling people right now is the perfect time to plant a garden, even if it's just a pot. If you live in a city and you only have a tiny balcony or a windowsill, that is enough that you could grow a tomato plant or a pea plant and you could actually produce some of your own food. And I believe it's really important for your body to connect to that. There's studies even showing that even some of the bacteria in the soil microbiome directly impacts our ability to cope with stress. So there's studies going on with PTSD patients that are even dosing them directly with soil microorganisms, and they're seeing the same effect that they have on the plants with their stress coping mechanism in the human body. So it's not always just about the food. I'm not recommending everyone eat a bunch of soil because there can be not so good things in there as well, but just to make the point that we are realizing these soil microorganisms have a huge positive effect also on the human body. And then really focusing on eating those 5 colors a day so we can really start to bring in those phytochemicals and those phytonutrients and making sure that we're supporting our body to cope with stress. The other thing that you're hearing more and more about is the intermittent fasting aspect of eating. So longevity regions don't just focus on the feeding aspect, they focus on the fasting aspect. And I think that scares a lot of people when we talk about fasting. So I don't mean the longer fast. That's something that, like, for example, Prolon is a 5-day fasting mimicking diet where you can do a prolonged fast. When I talk about this intermittent fasting, I'm talking about what we recommend, which is a 12-12 circadian rhythm fast. So I do prolonged fasting with different tools that support that, like Prolon, and then I do daily circadian rhythm fasting, which is a 12-12, and it allows my body to decompress and it supports my gut microbiome. And it basically just means you stop eating 3 to 4 hours before bed. And so I look at it as when I rise in the morning and the sun is up, I'm eating. When the sun comes down, I stop eating. It's just a simple way to look at it. And it allows my body to get into a rhythm, and it allows my gut microbiome to restore and refresh at night, and then to be prepared to digest food in the daytime when I'm back up and my metabolism's moving. So again, it allows that those different cycles of your body to go through in a proper way, like your melatonin and serotonin, that you have one come down and you have one come up, so you get that deep sleep and have the recovery. I think the other is reducing your toxin exposure. I think this is a perfect time, and I know people probably are like, oh, this is a hippie thing, but I do have to tell you, I started about maybe 6 years ago with a rule of thumb. If I can't drink or eat whatever I'm putting, like basically anything that I'm putting on my body, I take the same philosophy as I would want to put it in my body, or I should be okay putting it in my body. So I'm not saying it would taste good, but I technically could eat my deodorant, I could drink my shampoo, and that's because I've eliminated all of the different toxins out of my products that I buy, whether it's my makeup or my shampoo or my toothpaste. And it is a big transition to make, but if you start actually really researching and investigating a lot of your consumer products, you realize you can eliminate a lot of toxins from your system and your body. Even things like a daily cup of coffee. Coffee beans are one of the most chemically treated crops, and you rarely hear much about it. So just different things you can do to start reducing that chemical body burden as much as possible, so you let your body rest at night, regenerate, and you're not dosing it with more things that you can control, because there's going to be things that you can't control. And then getting enough sleep, I think this is really important. It's part of that cycle, and making sure that your body can recover when you're not eating. And then getting active. They have shown that your gut microbiome also responds very nicely to moderate activity. So it doesn't mean you have to have this intense activity, but that it does get your digestion moving properly, and it supports a healthy gut microbiome. So all of these things actually do support a healthy gut microbiome. Active movement, sleep, toxins have all been associated with the gut microbiome, which is where we focus a lot of our efforts on. So these are things that I would just recommend everyone consider, and they look at ways that they can really eat clean and live a healthy overall lifestyle. There are things that we see in the longevity diet book and Dr. Walter Longo's research, things that you can do to support and live like a centenarian, like these other regions do, with food being one of your first components. So I think I'm going to open it up if anyone has any questions, and hopefully we can answer anything that you may have.
Jennifer, that was fabulous. Thank you. And so I came back because we do have some great questions coming in, and I have so many thoughts about that. Again, thank you. I love I could talk all night with you about going from the disconnect and fear factor that I call it with food to getting much more connected and focusing on positive nutrition. So we'll do that in some very simple, doable ways. The first question, what do you think about hydroponics?
So hydroponics, I think there are benefits to hydroponics, but I think it's one of those things you still should understand how the crops are being grown. So on our farm, we use aquaponics. I specifically use aquaponics for the symbiotic relationship with the fish, and we don't have to discharge any chemicals. So we don't use any chemicals really in the greenhouse, other than, I can't say no chemicals because technically even the fish waste is a chemical, but natural. So we don't put any synthetic things. So fish create the waste, it creates this symbiotic relationship with the plants, and it cycles naturally through. So we don't have to discharge any water because of toxic salt buildup. So some processes of hydroponics do build up toxic salts. It's why a lot of towns, it's actually really hard to get permits to grow hydroponically if you don't have a desalination plant. So they can sometimes save a lot of water, but then if they have to discharge that water, that can be a negative side effect. So I think it's important to understand even hydroponics, what processes are being used, what's the growing media, and just understanding if it's truly an environmental benefit or if there are downsides to it. In general, it usually does consume less water. I think there are areas, like if you look at, I believe Abu Dhabi just invested $100 million in vertical farming in the deserts of Abu Dhabi. I think in an area like that, where conventional farming or regenerative farming is very challenging, potentially impossible, to try to grow that locally in Abu Dhabi for their own market, rather than importing, say, tomatoes from Mexico that are picked probably 6 weeks before their maturity, shipped on a sea freight container for a month, and then gassed once they're in Abu Dhabi. I would say the hydroponics is by far a better solution. So I do think in these arid regions where we can't sustainably grow a lot of crops, it's a good alternative for them to grow local regional food. So to me, it all depends on the reason for it. Do I think the solution to all farming is to cover all the surface of the earth with hydroponic facilities? No, but I do think it is a useful solution potentially in areas that really would struggle to grow produce in a good way. And the other thing is, with hydroponics, you can do it with a lot less chemicals. It just depends on the controlled environment. I prefer aquaponics above hydroponics, but aquaponics does have its own challenges. It's you're not dealing with just the plant system, which is complex enough on its own, but you're also dealing with a living fish system. So you need biologists that are focusing in both areas. So it is a advanced technique. It's one that I prefer, but it's not always as easy to implement and roll out in every region.
Excellent. Thank you. Very thorough distinction. That's helpful. Okay, so the next one, Jennifer, this is kind of a two-part question. Have you heard of a soil-related theory regarding selenium deficiency contributing to one's susceptibility to the coronavirus? Then she continues and says she heard that due to the high industrialization of China, that their soils mostly depleted specifically of selenium and could be a contributing factor to the spread of the disease. So she's just asking, have you heard of that? Not to, confirm or.
I haven't heard of it directly related to the coronavirus. I have heard that a lot of soils are depleted of selenium. That's one of the reasons we focus so heavy on regenerative farming, is when we add a lot of chemicals to the soil, we create a lot of imbalances. So you may have soil that's really high in nitrogen, but it's depleted in a lot of the micronutrients. So when we allow a farm and a system to become kind of equilibrated, or it achieves balance, the microorganisms start to pull the right nutrients out of the stores that are in the environment. So carbon, for example, 2/3 of our carbon stores in the soil are now atmospheric. It's the biggest sponge that we could reverse climate change with, is if we bring that carbon back into the soil. But it's true with a lot of micronutrients as well, that they would be more readily available if we built up the soil. So I don't doubt that there's a lot of micronutrient deficiencies, not just in China, but in the US as well. We used to have 11% soil organic matter across the US in our farmland. We're now down to below 1%. That is an indication of the health of your microbiome, because when you build up your soil microbiome, it builds up organic matter, and you build up filamental fungi and stuff like that, and they create this incredible sponge, and they create that incredible exchange of macro and micronutrients. So when you're down to 1%, even in the US, we have a lot of depletion of our soil and a lot of those micronutrients that aren't making it into your produce, and you don't see them on nutritional facts labels. It's pretty much invisible. So could it be a contributing factor to health in general? Absolutely. I can't speak to COVID, but I can tell you, I do think we are depleting ourselves from a lot of these nutrients.
Right, I would agree. Okay, kind of switching gears a little bit, and this is more of a general question on, I think, excuse me, Jennifer, GMOs, genetically modified foods. Can you just, I think there's a lot of fear around that, and so yeah, if you could just explain a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of genetic modification was done in those highly subsidized 4 crops. A lot of, for example, corn, there's a huge fear of corn. I've even had people ask me, like, how could you possibly eat corn? It's so like a main GMO crop. But actually the corn that we eat, the sweet corn, almost none of it is genetically modified. It's mainly grain corn. So, and the fortunate thing is, most vegetables and fruits in the market, very few of them have been modified, at least up till now. Because there's a lot of reasons that I'm not a huge fan. For me, the bigger one is the loss of biodiversity. When we modify something for a very specific thing, like a resistance to an herbicide, and we're specifically growing it for that reason, it means it's designed to do mass quantities of that one crop. So I think it just further proliferates the monocrop. And then a lot of seeds that are produced that way are sterile. So one of the things I mentioned is plants do pass down part of their microbiome through their seeds. So if you have sterile seeds, the history of that plant and its microbiome and the ability for it to pass down that knowledge, I believe we eliminate. So from a farming standpoint, I do have a lot of issues, because I think as an organic farmer, just as an example, it's really challenging. We don't even bother growing corn anymore because our trials of corn were cross-pollinated by GMO crops. So I think to have GMO crops that are open pollinating, which unfortunately most of them are, there's no way for farms around you to control that, because literally pollen can travel almost 100 miles by birds or different pollinator insects. And it puts the entire burden of control on the organic farmers. So I personally think it's somewhat irresponsible to release crops into the environment that we can't control. So, and if we're actually losing genetic diversity because of it, I also think that that's a challenge. That's my personal belief. I don't know that from a standpoint of the GMO itself that it's, I mean, again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I don't have as many health concerns. It's more what comes with it. So using heavy amounts of herbicide because the crops were designed to be resistant to that herbicide. It means we're using a lot of herbicide. So that's more what I associate it with, is what are the potential consequences on more chemicals being used. Even if we say less pesticides are being used, we know that more herbicides are likely being used. And can it be controlled, or are we eliminating heirloom varieties because we can't actually control open pollinated crops? So those are some of the things that I get concerned about. I guess they're a little bit more on the sustainable agriculture side, on the importance of heirloom varieties, things that we don't yet know the health benefits of, that we could lose those. Losing a lot of the soil diversity because of monocropping and a lot of the herbicides and different pesticides and things that are used. Those are still used with GMOs. It hasn't allowed us to completely eliminate those. And I personally believe we spend a lot of time focusing on GMOs to solve certain problems, when I think we could have focused on the soil biology side and understanding how we could support those crops in a similar way to be resistant to stress. So whether it's from pests, I think we could do less with pesticides and more on understanding the microorganisms that could help us defend against those pests, and herbicides and things like that. So it's a tricky subject. I believe we can grow crops and heirloom varieties and still feed the world if we just focus on less meat and different types of farming practices. But that's my personal belief. I think it's a good discussion to continue to have as a society. I think that people should know what's in their food, so I do think we should push for labeling of GMOs, because I think people should have a choice. If they don't care, great, they can buy the GMO crops. I think if they do care, they should have that choice. So those are just my main things. Is I think we should have better control for open pollinated GMO crops. It concerns me that there's no real control over it when they can travel 100 miles. And I think they should be labeled. And those are my two biggest things around GMO.
Fabulous. No, it's a very complex issue, and that was wonderfully described. And that transparency, exactly. So transparency is extremely important. We're getting so many good questions. So I'm going to try to bring up ones that kind of are in line with what you just tackled. And here's one. So a lot about meat and fasting and various things, but in what ways do you see a path for the average person to support healthy farming practices? What trends do you see emerging in farming so it's two questions, in the next 10 to 20 years? So,
okay. So I think to support healthy farming, I mean, I think a really important thing is if you're in an area where there are farms, like I'm in New Jersey, there's farms actually all around us. So you do have access to local farms. So going to farmers markets, talking to your farmers, really understanding how they grow their produce. I think there are some labels starting to come out on regenerative farms. So you can not only see that it's, for example, organic is a certification, you can see it's going to have less chemicals, it's going to be non-GMO, but it may not mean that it's using regenerative farming practices. So there's different certifications coming out that can at least give that transparency to people. I think everything is a step in the right direction, but it's all about that awareness. How can I be more aware of how this food is grown? Where is it grown? Is it being shipped all the way from, say I'm in New Jersey from Mexico? You know, is there something I can get more local than that? So I just think it's all about that awareness and supporting farmers that are transitioning to these different practices, some of them of which certifications don't yet exist, but will probably even within the next year. So there's a lot of movement in that space and a lot of new certifications to bring that transparency. And there are already some sustainable agriculture certifications that you're starting to see pop up in different products. So I think organic is a good first step, and you're seeing it more ubiquitous everywhere. So I think that it has been a good progress moving forward. It's one step in the right direction. It's not everything. So I think we need to continue to make steps in the right direction. I think what we're going to see in the next 5 years is major innovation in the hydroponic, aquaponic, vertical growing space, where we can grow more food moving up rather than outward. I do think we're going to have a lot more plant-based food. I think the watch out there is that it doesn't just replace meat with more highly processed food. So I still think whole fruits and vegetables are one of the easiest, most important things to introduce to your diet. And even people that are on a tight budget ask me, well, I can't, or they say, I can't afford to eat all organic. And I say, that's fine. There's certain crops that actually have very little contaminants on them. They've been tested. Focus on those if you're eating them fresh. And the other ones you could even eat frozen. Like I drink a lot of smoothies. And I blend some phytonutrients with those, or different superfoods with phytonutrients. But I'll just use frozen organic strawberries or blueberries because they're far less expensive than the fresh ones. I still eat fresh ones if I'm just having a snack. But there are ways that you can add these to your diet in a cost-effective way. So I think you're going to have more and more awareness of that. You're going to have the cost come down of a lot of the organic and more naturally grown produce. I think you're going to have a lot of the vertical farming coming into play. And I think you're going to have a lot of what they call deconstructive agriculture, which is deconstructing what's not working about our current agriculture, or what we call modern agriculture, and actually going back to some of the more basic things that are less destructive to the soil. So I think I would say farming, in my opinion, never went through a real innovation or we went through the Industrial Revolution. The Green Revolution, to me, was the introduction of massive use of chemicals. I don't think it was really a step forward in agriculture. If you even talk to the USDA, they've even quoted that tilling has probably been the most destructive mechanism that we've brought into agriculture. So I think in the next 5 years, you're going to start seeing a reversal of a lot of these things we considered innovation at the time. Right. And we're going to start moving away from those things. And I do believe that new exciting innovations are going to replace it, that can still allow us to do organic farming and be more supportive of the environment rather than destructive. And the good thing, or what's exciting to me, is there's money behind it now. So you have big companies now that are wanting to offset their carbon footprint by buying carbon credits from farms. And once you put money behind it, money talks. So I think that we will start seeing these changes. We are already starting to see them. So I think that's going to be what we see in the next 5 years, is more regenerative farms supported by carbon credits to offset carbon created by larger companies that aren't growing farms. I think you're going to see a lot more focus on the environmental aspects. They've quoted that if you changed all of the electricity in the United States to solar energy, it would still take us 100 years to reverse climate change. If we just changed 30% of our farms to regenerative farms, we could start reversing it within a year. So I do think people are going to become much more aware of the environmental aspects of agriculture as well, the environmental aspects of the meat, and how we can start to reduce that. So lots of change, I think, in this space.
So much. And I'm so glad we recorded this, because that's really profound. And then when people go back and hear that, it will register. Okay, Jennifer, we're running short on time. I'm going to ask just 2 more quick questions. I hope, and because it's important, and maybe more just to reiterate that connection between stress on a plant, and then I'm going to summarize this as the phytonutrient content of how healthy is that, and how nutrient dense is that plant that you're then eating, based on both the soil microbiome and the stress the plant has experienced.
Okay. So I think from a plant standpoint, as I mentioned, the biggest value to a plant is the biodiversity in their soil. So that's why we talk about the Holo biome, which is all the DNA of the plant and all its surrounding microorganisms. And the reason why that's so important is it has that diversity to draw on if it's going through a drought situation or a pest situation or some sort of other biotic or abiotic stress on that plant. It's giving that plant the ability to draw on that and have a transaction with those organisms to help it cope with stress. So, and in a lot of cases, that's associated with a phytochemical that's sent through the plant to, especially when it comes to a pest, or maybe it has high, heavy sun exposure and it needs to protect itself from that UV exposure. It can send out these phytochemicals to create strength within the plant. I consider it its immune system of a plant and its ability to cope with stress. So phytochemicals are signaling to that plant, do these different things. It can trigger different modulation of how the cells respond to things. So again, it might just purely create the chemicals to either potentially even kill the insects or deter them. But it might also send something, like I said, to where it's going to even tell the root mass to grow in a different way. So a lot of different modulation of how that plant responds to that stress. And when those plants create a lot of phytochemicals, which are oftentimes we can see those through pigmentation, which is associated with those phytochemicals, if we're eating those plants, they can trigger similar stress coping in our own bodies. So we can also use that to feed our gut microbiome and to cope with stress as well. As I mentioned, things like serotonin are produced in the gut. So certain foods are going to make us feel better than other foods because our gut microbiome is going to respond to those. And a lot of neurotransmitters are created in the gut, similar to serotonin. A lot of your immune system, so if you have a healthy gut microbiome, it's also lining your gut and protecting from leaky gut and different gut disorders that could cause a lot of problems also with inflammation and your immune system potentially having an autoimmune disease or something like that. So I think it's just looking at how you can build up that gut microbiome and your overall body and your system to not trigger adverse responses, but to actually optimize your ability to cope with stress. And that's kind of how the two are connected.
Right, excellent. And I'm just throwing in my comment there, how stress does make us more resilient. It has, helped humans and plants survive. It's an important part of, getting stronger and more resilient through all of this stress. So that's my little side comment. Okay, final question. There are quite a few, Jennifer. This is fabulous. I wish we could talk all night. Related to meat, though, kind of some specifics.
Yes.
What is your recommendation on the frequency or infrequency of meat consumption? What's the recommended amount to eat?
I mean, I definitely encourage a reducitarian. I don't eat much meat at all. I do eat a little bit of fish, so I maybe eat fish once or twice a week, probably max. I personally don't eat much red meat or chicken or any of those meats at this point in my life, mainly for environmental reasons. But for me, it's not you must have this much meat in your diet to survive. You can absolutely get all that protein from plants, but I know that's a really extreme approach for most people. So what I do is I encourage people to remove meat out of your diet 2 days a week. If you're eating, like my husband, when earlier on in our marriage, if he didn't think meat, if meat wasn't on the plate, he didn't think it was a meal. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he consumed meat 7 days a week. So
we all know.
Yeah, so he now probably 5 days a week doesn't have any meat, and then he's reduced it substantially on those other days. So but every year he reduced it a little bit less, replaced it with other healthier proteins. So for me, I really, I actually avoided being a vegan for a long time because my brothers were both vegetarians, vegans, and to me it was like a label, and I was like, I'm not being labeled one of these things. So I do think it scares a lot of people and turns them off even. So I think it's really important that if you are eating meat, you look at how you can reduce that, but that you're replacing it with really good quality protein. If you're just gonna eat a salad with just lettuce, not a good idea. You really have to look at that you're replacing it with high quality plant-based proteins. But for me, it's all about a reducitarian diet. If we can all reduce our footprint, if we can all eat less meat, then it's better for the environment. There's lots of studies showing the benefits from a human health standpoint. If I put it in perspective of a centenarian, if you look at Dr. Walter Longo's book, The Longevity Diet, some of the areas in Italy that he researched, people had red meat like twice in their life. So they didn't label themselves a vegan or a vegetarian. It's just, if you look at those regions, it was extremely expensive because they put the full cost of it. If you looked at the full cost of what it really is to produce a cow, if you look at that 80% of our farmland is focused on producing grain and things like that, and you look at the environmental effect of it, and you look at the health effect, you know, I'm not against people that consume small amounts of really high quality meat, as long as they know where their food's coming from and they're not just buying like large factory farmed meat, which I think is very devastating to the environment. So I don't think there's a perfect answer. I would just encourage people to start having full days of no meat, but really like getting good quality replacement in there of plant-based protein. And if you're already very low on meat, like maybe to move to a vegetarian or a vegan, you know, it's doable. I don't think there's any nutritional deficiency that you have to have when you do that. I just think you have to be aware of what are the healthy protein alternatives, like chickpeas. Chickpeas are an incredible alternative protein that is just across the board healthy and really common in Sardinia and Calabria, two of the biggest longevity regions that are really well documented. Calabria being where Dr. Longo's from, and Sardinia being studied for quite some time.
Thank you. I could talk about blue zones and longevity regions all night. and I agree, that's a really doable approach. Simply reduce, and I would like to challenge everybody too with it, eating more variety overall of there's so many fruits and vegetables and whole grains. I'm into mung beans, thanks to you, to be honest. And yeah. All right, finally, and before we might get cut off, I honestly don't know with Zoom, so I apologize to everybody if we do. Everybody will receive a recording of this webinar. The last thing I want to touch on, because it is so common, is about the intermittent fast. I'm speaking very fast right now.
Yeah.
Just to reiterate, what do you mean? Somebody asked, what do you mean by the 12-12 intermittent fast? So just
okay, so a 12-12 is just, you have 12 hours of a feeding window and 12 hours of a fasting window. So it's what we call the circadian rhythm fast, and it gets your body into a circadian rhythm. So it may mean, for example, that you stop eating at 7:30 at night, and if you go to bed at, say, 11 o'clock at night, and then you would resume eating again at 7:30 in the morning. So it's actually a very natural rhythm to get your body in. You're not ever feeling starved. You might initially if you're like a big time snacker at night, but again, it allows your body to completely stop metabolizing food as far as like a massive amount of energy focusing on digesting your food, and it allows you to move into that recovery state where you're detoxify all of your organs that are designed to detoxify and regenerate move into their natural state of doing that. So not only is it important to eat healthy food that helps your body naturally move into those rhythms, but to actually get it on a cycle. So that's the 12-12, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. To me, the easiest way to do it is just stop eating 3 to 4 hours before bed. In most cases, you'll get a deeper sleep because it actually allows you to move with your melatonin levels going up in a perfect curve, as they're supposed to, going into your deepest REM sleep. And then as the sun starts to rise and your body starts to wake up, your melatonin goes down and your serotonin starts to go up. So it's this reverse curve. And the 12-12 allows you to see that curve equal out the way it should.
Right, exactly. It's true. And I talk about it with members I coach in general. It's just a very healthy practice. That's what breakfast is, breaking the fast after a good 12-hour fast.
And it's very easy to build into your lifestyle. I think when people hear about fasting, they're very nervous, like it's going to be this massive commitment, but it's very easy to do a 12-12. It's something you can do for the rest of your life. It's not just, I'm going to do it for a week. It's something that you can really get in a rhythm and do it forever.
Exactly. It's part of your daily habits and lifestyle.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to end on kind of a farming note. And so this is, somebody commented on how we're aware, at least a lot of people are, of more CSAs, so community supported agriculture, if people don't know. We even recommend them through Castle Connolly. And so is this movement big enough to make a difference, is the question.
A movement to CSAs, or?
Yeah, I think that's the question, like local farms and CSAs and that, like, versus the big farming production.
I think, I don't know that we're going to have a massive shift in a lot more small farms. I do think you're starting to see it a little bit, but I think the biggest shift is going to be that the bigger farms start to, I don't know if you'd say modularize, but start really diversifying those large farms. I mean, you have some farms, 30,000 acres, all with corn and wheat. And I think what you're going to have is, while those may still be owned by a large individual or company, I think that you'll start having like 20 acres like this and 30 acres like that. And I think you're going to have more innovation brought into organic farming, where it's less labor intensive, where you can do it on a larger scale. So I don't know that we'll see this huge resurgence of CSAs. In my area, they're everywhere. So I mean, I'm really lucky. But when I've talked to people on the West Coast about CSAs, they're like, CS what? So it's not as common across the US. Yeah. And so it would be nice, because there are plenty of farms in California and different places, that it becomes a more common term and people really get excited about it and believe in it. I do think more meal kits are getting into it. I mean, that's our passion behind this with Nutrition for Longevity, is how do we get that food to people in a very efficient, quick way, so it's picked at its prime and you're getting it fresh. So I do think you're going to start seeing it come back in different forms, but I don't know that we're ever going to see a complete reversal of the large, massive farms. I just think you're going to start seeing them change their focus and diversify. And I do think, there's a lot of analysts showing that there's going to be a lot less meat consumption in the future. So you're going to have a lot of these big farms focusing on grain corn and soybeans, but mainly for feed. I think they're going to look at other areas that they can make money, and hopefully that's on healthy fruits and vegetables.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to say, this was just such invaluable information. You are a wealth of information. I hope people understand now why, and I was so excited to speak with you this evening. I think we're going to end it there. Okay. I know that there are still questions coming in, and I apologize. I think we've just run out of time this evening, but thank you for all you do, Jennifer, and I sincerely mean that. And I hope people did come away with a lot of empowering information and positive information, because it's an exciting time in everything that's going on right now. I do think that we are in this movement to make a lot of progress to a healthier environment, healthier food, and healthier humans. So Absolutely. That's right.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone's time. I know it's a lot right now to give up an hour. And if anyone is interested, we did launch United for Longevity, which is our nonprofit. We are raising funds for frontline workers and using food to support with chronic and acute illnesses. So something that I'm very passionate about and excited that we also launched. So you can go to United4longevity.com if you'd like to make a donation.
Thank you yes, it's fabulous. I support you 100%. You are one of the heroes out there making a huge difference. So thank you. Thank everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope to see you again soon. Okay, be safe, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer, and get home safely.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.